In late August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina smashed into the coastline of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and the death toll rose to 1,800. Of those who lost their lives, a remarkable 2/3 were disabled and/or elderly. Based on this, I know you'll agree that the needs of persons with disabilities are crucial for emergency workers, shelter managers, staff, and volunteers to be familiar with and obtain some understanding. In this video, we'll hear from people with special needs and from family members who are caregivers. We hope you'll gain insight into the challenges facing persons with disabilities in a sheltering environment. Some participants on this panel have communication difficulties, others have mobility obstacles, and some have experience with cognitive behavior disorders. Weather emergencies are tough on all of us, but they're especially hard for people who have special needs. An emergency will often increase the accommodations that are necessary for persons with disabilities. For example, a person who is hard of hearing can become more hearing impaired in a shelter setting with large numbers of people talking at the same time. And an individual with cognitive disorders will likely be more confused and disoriented in a shelter. As a shelter volunteer, healthcare worker, or manager, you can expect to have persons with disabilities at your shelter. And the greater the emergency, the larger the number and the more varying disabilities you will encounter. Through this presentation, you will learn accommodations, etiquette, and tips to help make the sheltering experience more accessible for persons with disabilities. Hi, I'm Rob Lorai, the moderator of this program. Let me introduce our panel. Mike Gonzalez is the Special Operations Chief of the Tampa Fire Rescue Department, and he has a child with autism. Julia Michalka-Barber is an independent living coordinator at Reliance, and she is deaf. She also has 2 children who are deaf. Deodat Joda is a volunteer at Reliance and is in a wheelchair after becoming a victim of a shooting in New York. Dolores Blanchett is a mother of an adult son who is in a wheelchair and is deaf. She is elderly and has her own physical limitations due to arthritis. Patrick Hendry is Executive Director of the Florida Peer Network and has himself a mental illness. He went to Mississippi after Katrina to work with the mentally ill in recovery from the storm. And finally, Marian Guizdala is blind and uses a guide dog. Thank you for coming, everybody. Good to have you here. Let's talk about when somebody who has a disability walks into a shelter for the first time after they've evacuated and they come in. How does a shelter worker identify somebody who has a disability? And Julia, let me start with you, as somebody who's hearing impaired.
For the deaf and hard of hearing, normally we will let you know that we need communication method. For me, personally, I will go in the shelter and find somebody in the shelter and let them know I'm deaf. And that would be a good point for me to get, because you can't see it. If it's someone like, who might have cognitive disabilities, who's also deaf and hard of hearing, they might have a little difficulty approaching a hearing person because they have that distrust in the hearing world. So you just have to observe and make sure, okay, well, are they getting the information or not?
Do all deaf people communicate through sign language, or are there varying modes of communication?
There are different modes of communication. You've got American Sign Language. You've also got French Sign Language, which is based on French or German. You have Q-Speech, which is a different sign language. You have speech reading. So you've got total communication, which is sign language, including speech reading. So you've got a whole bunch.
And you mentioned people who are deaf or hard of hearing. The other term that I used, hearing impaired, that's not a word that we should use.
For most of the deaf community, because we consider ourselves in the deaf community, we are very prideful of us. We don't think of us as being impaired hearing because we had nothing to lose in the beginning. So the correct terminology would be the deaf or hard of hearing.
Okay. Patrick, let's go down to you. For somebody who's mentally ill walking in, another case where by looking at the person walking into the shelter, you might not realize that they are mentally ill.
Most of the times you wouldn't even know it. I mean, for most people, unless they're in a particular crisis or having a difficulty, mental illness itself doesn't have a face, but some of the medications produce side effects that are identified as mental illness. So sometimes people will have a strange gait or strange head movements or a lolling of the tongue, which is a side effect of old line medications they've used for years. But other than that, you're not going to know when a person's mentally ill, and they may or may not choose to divulge it. So what you're really looking for is a person in distress. Also, people will refer to themselves frequently as consumers. It's the word we use in our community to describe ourselves, and a number of other people use that same word. So when you go up and say, I'm a consumer, consumer of what? In our case, it's consumer of mental health services.
And if those physical characteristics that you talked about, if people are on medication, that might be a tip-off for those people who are on medication who have those physical characteristics.
Well, they mimic some other physical disabilities too. So it's really, I think some folks identify those types of movements particularly with mental illness, but it's not the illness itself, and it doesn't have any implication as to how ill the person is. It may just be that they've got permanent side effects from some of the old line medications they took. But it's scary to a lot of folks. They think I'm dealing with somebody who's very ill because they look strange and they move their head funny and they move their tongue in and out of their mouth. And so it's kind of like this person must be very ill. And that's not necessarily the case.
What should a shelter worker do in that case? I mean, if a shelter worker is scared and they see somebody behaving this way, what's the best way to begin to establish a rapport?
Well, I think if you see somebody who's in distress, I wouldn't make that call just based on those kind of physical things, but more if someone's in distress. If they're pacing, if they seem to be responding to auditory hallucinations, if they seem to be responding to something that you're not aware of, or if they're talking to themselves, if their eyes are darting back and forth, then you might want to just, ask that person if you can be of assistance. Usually people with mental illness have spent so much of their life talking about their illness that they're not shy to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And they will self-disclose. Mm-hmm. And they're usually happy to get somebody who will listen to them, because that's mainly what you can do for a person who's in a crisis, in a shelter-type situation. Particularly, when we went up to Mississippi for Katrina, the people were in shelters for weeks at a time. In fact, I think I was there till the 5th week, and people were still in some of the shelters. And so people had run out of medications. They had no contact with their caregivers. They didn't really know, where they even came from. Some folks had decompensated so much in their illness that by the end of the 2nd or 3rd week, without medications, they were so profoundly ill they couldn't even tell you where they came from.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that topic too a little bit later on in the program. Mike, your son has autism?
Yes.
And when your son, let's say he comes into the shelter, let's say that you're with him, how would you go up to the shelter workers and say something to the shelter workers, or does it need to be identified in your mind?
Yes, we'll probably self-report to the shelter workers. However, obviously an intake form would be a big benefit, because individuals who suffer with the autism spectrum disorder, have varying levels of impairment. So some, will have more communication flaws and other needs. So it's important to maybe get a form so that the caregiver or the parent can put down some of the particular needs of that individual.
So this would be a form that you would write down the needs of the individual, maybe what medication your son is on? And
yes, medications might work, whether or not they use those medications to sleep, which would answer other questions as far as, maybe having to separate them at nighttime in case if they suffer from insomnia. In new situations, those medications sometimes might not work, or other methods that might be appropriate to help soothing or calming the individual, like playing music. Some of those methods might interfere with the sleep habits of other people in the shelter, so things like that can be identified. Mm-hmm. Forms of communicating to these individuals, some might communicate or understand better with picture schedules, and some other methods work depending on what works best, what strategies. Sometimes you can find that out in an intake form, and then that can help the shelter worker better communicate with that individual.
Let me go through the whole panel and just find out. And Mary, we could start maybe at your end of the panel. Is it a good idea that the shelter workers go up and talk to all the people that are staying there to identify Because we don't know if a person who has special needs may go to a special needs shelter or may end up in a general shelter. Should the workers talk to all the people that come in?
I think that those of us in the disability community, if we're going to need some special assistance when we get to a shelter, that we'll identify ourselves and let them know. Not all people who are disabled are going to be going to special needs shelters. And I wanted to touch upon too, when you're talking about identification, and back up just a second, and as far as for someone who is blind, many times people who are blind may not have a guide dog or a white cane to identify them as being blind. Some people don't use one. Some people may come in without one and with a sighted guide, a friend or a family member who's going to be at the shelter as well. But I think that it's up to the individual. The term consumers has been used, that we are consumers, and as consumers we know what it is that we want and need to consume. So if we need assistance, generally we have the ability to ask for it and know specifically which assistance we need.
You know, I gather that when a person who has disabilities goes to a shelter, one of the things that they want to be treated like is treated like an adult, a whole person, not be talked down to, treated with some dignity. Joe, would you agree with that?
Very much so. I think to add to what the other panel said is that if you are at the shelter, or if when you do need to go there, I think you should inform the shelter workers a little bit about your disability. You know, I think someone mentioned about having a form, you know, that where you could fill out some personal information, and in regards to your disability, it will make their assistance to you much easier, you know, by understanding your disability a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And also I would say, and add to that, provided that person wants to fill out such a form. It shouldn't be a necessity based upon their disability, but if they are going to need some sort of accommodations due to their disability and wish to fill out such a form, that be so. I wouldn't want to think that everyone needs to come in and disclose that they have a disability if they don't want to do so.
Okay, Patrick?
Yeah, I think maybe particularly with people with mental illness, a lot of people are afraid of disclosing, because with our particular disability, we've often been treated quite badly in all kinds of situations. People are fearful of mental illness. They don't understand it. They're used to the stereotypes that they see on television, the things that they've heard in the news, and they tend to generalize and think that all people with mental illness are a certain way. So a lot of folks will not self-disclose until maybe they need help, and a lot of times that's going to be the only way you're going to know that they have a disability, and then they may not be able to tell you what's going on. So ours is kind of an invisible illness until something bad happens usually. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult for people to
What's your best advice, though, to a shelter worker who hears that and says, oh my gosh, what do I do? What's the best way to avoid a negative experience for the person who comes in, the other people in the shelter?
Well, I think, as I said before, some folks will self-disclose. And for those people, I mean, you want to make sure if you can, if it's available and the shelter's set up in a way where you can perhaps have those folks in an area that's a little bit more quiet, a little less accessible to a lot of motion going on. But as you identify somebody in crisis, the best thing you can do is talk to them. You talk to them in a respectful voice. If they're agitated, you talk softer. If they continue to escalate, you talk even softer and slower. That a lot of times will make a person have to listen to you. And you keep the conversation in the here and now. You talk to them about what's going on right now. Try not to go into what might happen in the future. They may be concerned about what's going on because of the event itself. But for the most part, you treat them like people that are just in distress.
Mm-hmm. What we don't want to do is we don't want to assume that someone, because of whatever disability they have, needs a specific kind of assistance. Because someone may feel, for instance, that I need some assistance that I don't want and impose it upon me just because they think all blind people need to have this or that.
So is the best thing for the shelter worker to do to approach a person and ask in a respectful way, if you need help, no? I'm here for you?
Mm-hmm.
The same thing can be said for the deaf or hard of hearing. So if I go to the shelter, I would come up to the shelter worker and let them know I am deaf and I read lips. And they may have someone looking around for someone that knows sign and automatically put that signing person next to me. And I don't want a 24-hour bodyguard. So I would rather say, give me the choice. I don't need the signing, but if there's something major going on, just have her come up to me and let me know.
Let's talk about accommodations, because Patrick, you talked about that. And Dolores, let me ask you, accommodations for people with disabilities, what kinds of things should shelter workers be thinking about? In your case, you have a son who's in a wheelchair, and you yourself have arthritis. What kind of things should the shelter be thinking about in terms of you and your son?
They should be thinking about his needs. At this time, he will be in need of depends. He'll need a portable potty, and he will need assistance. And I'm the one that usually assists him. For sure, I definitely will be with him. And everyone here that have spoken about how to identify themselves, he automatically would do that. He's totally deaf. He's competent mentally. Eventually, according to the disease, he will be blind. In fact, one of his eyes, the plaque in his eye is totally white. And he have no movement, no more than what we're trying to do now to strengthen his legs so he could at least try to start walking with a walker. But if anything happened all of a sudden, he would definitely have to have someone with him at all times.
Would you be the person that would be with your son if you were to go into a shelter now?
Yes.
Would you be in a position to give him care that he needs in the shelter?
I would have to, even in my situation. And then for myself, I would just deal with what I have to do, my pain. And now if my body locks up on me, then I would have to have someone for him, because that has happened before.
Joda, the accommodations for people who are spinal cord injured in shelters is very critical. And one of the most critical things is a bed. Talk about what kind of beds are needed for people who have spinal cord injuries.
Well, every spinal cord injury has a different level. Someone who is a C2, C1 quad may not be able to do anything for themselves, whether it's to get in a transfer into the bed or transfer into the wheelchair from the bed. A person who is paraplegic may be more better to be able to do so, you know. So they should be in shelters that should have accommodation, you know, where it's a Hoyer lift, or if it's an individual with a sliding board to be able to get to and in and out of a bed. A bed is also critical. The right bed is so important for the shelter to be available in the shelter for individuals with spinal cord, is because a person with spinal cord injury, you know, pretty much lay in one position, you know, so a mat or a simple mattress that they may throw on the ground may not be the right thing for that.
Why is that?
Because by laying in one position, you could encounter pressure sores. So if you don't have the right bed or accommodation, you know, for sleeping or to lay on, you know, you're only likely to have a breakdown. So it is very important for the shelter to be equipped with beds that will be suitable for individuals who have spinal cord injury.
These would be hospital-style beds that would prevent...
Hospital-style bed, and at the same time, a bed that can be lowered and high and low, so that, you know, the transfer is even easier to get on. For the head to be raised, that if a person cannot get up by him or herself, the bed will be an electrical bed in such a way that the person could sit up to eat or elevate their foot, you know, or something to make
Give us an idea of how dangerous it is for somebody who's a spinal cord injured person laying in a mat on the ground, just a conventional mattress, who develops bed sores. How dangerous is that for the person?
Well, let us simply just have a regular bed, and that by laying on one position, and they have a breakdown, you know, of a sore that could lead to infection, you know, and make matter more worse for the person.
They often do not feel it.
And because they don't have the normal sensation, after what Julie just said, they don't feel because they're impaired. Their spinal cord has been impaired where they don't have normal sensation. So they would not even know that, well, their feet or their bottom need to be released from that pressure. So,
Is it a good idea to keep all people who are spinal cord injured together, all people who are in wheelchairs together, or to group people according to their disability? Julie, I see you're shaking your head no.
I don't think it have to be where you group them because they're all spinal cord or hearing impaired or visually impaired in one group, you know, because it's a shelter. You know, they may not be able to accommodate that situation.
I think it's more stereotypical if you group them together in a corner somewhere. So it's just, you might have them hang out together, or they might do that, but to put them together, I think they're negative.
It's negative. Let's talk more about accommodations. Marion, what kind of accommodations do you need as a blind person?
As a blind person, I don't need any real specific accommodations myself. And again, I think one of the key elements that we have to mention over and over and over is that though we're here representing a disability, individual differences are also need to be taken into consideration. So as myself, as a blind person, I may not need any specific accommodations. However, some of the things that might be helpful would be orientation to the environment. We're coming in as blind people without the ability to look around and say, oh, there's the sign for the bathroom. It would be nice to know where the bathrooms are, where the water is, a little bit of orientation to the environment that we are going to be staying in for a while, because we may never have been there before.
Is a tour of the area always a good idea for everybody?
I wouldn't say that it's always a good idea. I'm the kind of person who doesn't mind striking out on my own and saying, I'm going to go find the bathrooms.
Yeah.
Not everybody is going to be that way. So again, if it's something that someone says, I'm blind, could you orient me to the environment, then they will either say, here's what I need to know, or you should ask, well, what is it specifically you need to know? A person is going to be there for a while, they're going to be living there for a few days. It would be good for them to feel comfortable in their environment and know where the essential areas are.
And Joe, what do you think about a tour?
That's important.
I think it's important that the individuals who will be in the shelter should be enlightened a little as to where is what and where is what's not. You know, in this way they are aware of their environment that they need to get to or from. You know, it will make it easier for them. You know, instead, here you are facing a situation outside with a hurricane or a storm or whatever it is, and you're inside and you don't even know where to get from point A to point B. It can only make matter worse. You know, so by being, enlightened a little about your surrounding, it wouldn't hurt.
Okay, and Dolores, I see you nodding your head yes too.
I say the same thing. It's very important, I think.
Mary, let me go back to you. What about your service dog, though? And that's the correct term for the dog. It's not. It's a service dog.
Well, the general term for an animal that assists a person with a disability is a service animal, because it may be more than just a dog. This specifically, my dog would be called a guide dog, but it's a type of service animal. And a service animal is any animal that's been individually trained to provide a service to an individual who is disabled. And
you know,
so
that's a really good-looking dog. I'm tempted to pet it.
normally they don't get petted.
Is it bad form for me to pet it?
It depends upon, again, it depends upon the dog. I say the rule of thumb is don't pet the guide dog. The guide dog is a working animal. It needs to focus its attention on what it's doing, and petting is a distraction to the dog when someone else is doing that. Now, you know, we're dealing with shelters. We're dealing with areas where the dogs may not always be, quote unquote, working. Louisa may not look like she's working right now. She's got the kind of job I'd like to have, where you can lay on the floor and fall asleep while you're on the job. But when she's got her harness on, she is a working animal, and that's one of the elements of a guide dog. Again, not all service animals are going to be wearing a harness. And if someone wants to pet the guide dog, they should ask the handler first whether they can or not.
Okay.
It's interesting to me that you say service animal. Are there other animals besides dogs that are service animals?
Yes, there are.
What kind of animals?
Well, for instance, there are a couple people that are blind who have miniature horses that are service animals. There are a variety of animals which have specific functions. Some people who are, for instance, quadriplegic may have a spider monkey who acts as their hands and retrieves objects. And again, the key element of determining what is a service animal and what is simply a pet is the training. And so what a shelter worker can do when a person comes in with an animal and says, this is my service animal, is to ask them, one, what service does the animal provide? And two, how was the animal trained? Because those are the two key elements for determining what is a service animal. There is no identification, there is no certification. An individual can train their own animal as a service animal, provided, again, it performs a task that is a benefit to the person who is disabled.
3 issues come up with the service animal. That is, how do you feed it? How do you make sure it gets water? And how does it go to the bathroom?
Okay, well, if everyone else has water, then the service animal will have water as well. As far as the food is concerned, if I were to evacuate to a shelter, I would bring the food with me. It's not a good idea for someone to feed the food, different food other than what it's used to, especially because it's going to be in a confined area where we go to the third part of it, and how do you relieve the animal? If you feed the animal something different than what it's used to eating, it could have gastrointestinal issues, and that's not going to be a pleasant thing for the shelter workers to deal with. So keeping things as consistent for the animal, and including the food it's eating, is very important. As far as relieving the animals, we're putting together information which will describe exactly how to go about creating a relief area for the animal, especially during the height of an emergency, when it may not be safe to go outside in a Category 4 storm, and I got to go outside and relieve my dog. So we're going to develop some protocol as to building indoor relief areas for times when people may not be able to get outside of the shelter. But that's going to be
one more question about that.
Sure.
Can you ever be separated from your animal? Or I mean, can one of the shelter workers take your dog outside to relieve itself, or is it not a good idea to have you separated?
Well, can they and should they, and what is the law? Basically, the individual is responsible for the care of the animal while they're there. So if I come there with my service animal, I am responsible for all of its care. The shelter worker is not. Can the shelter worker, if you say, the shelter worker says, can I take your dog out? And some people may say, yes, you can. But I would say that it's up to the individual. If the individual asks the shelter worker if they can, and the shelter worker doesn't want to, they're not required to. So legally, in any times that the dog is in a public place, the individual handler is responsible for the care and control of that dog. Can it ever be separated? It can be separated if the animal, whatever that animal is, poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others.
Let me go to Mike for a moment. Mike, your son has autism. I'm wondering about the noise in the shelter, because undoubtedly, there's going to be a lot of people there. They're not soundproof facilities. How does your son deal with noise, and what advice would you give shelter workers about noise?
Well, when you're in new environments, and especially if there's a lot of sensory output going on, like noise, that kind of is exhibited in some maladaptive behaviors like screeching, body tensing, other things that might lead to self-infliction of pain like scratching, biting, head banging, things like that. So it's important to try to find things that can calm these individuals down. Things such as television, small video games, paper and crayons so they can color. If you can keep them occupied, then sometimes you can, help get their minds off of all the sensory that they're taking in, and that could have a calming effect.
Okay. And what about finding a quiet room for people with autism? Or, and Patrick, let me ask you the same question. How does noise affect mentally ill? And before we go to Patrick, Mike, what about a separate room for people with autism?
Yeah, that's important, a room that you can go to kind of help calm down. The reason that's important is because it's a very stressful situation, not only for the child, but for the parent and the caregiver. As soon as the child starts exhibiting some of these maladaptive behaviors, then they cause increased stress and anxiety on individuals around them. That then has a residual effect back to the parents and caregivers, because now they're taking in that, their child is causing discomfort to others, so they start increasing their stress and anxiety. So obviously, if you can remove, from that situation, get somewhere you can calm down, it would be a big help. Also, they sometimes have a buildup of energy that they need to release, and might need to go somewhere where they can maybe just jump up and down, run back and forth from wall to wall for a little bit, and help kind of relieve some of that built-up stress.
So the shelter workers should expect to see this kind of behavior with some people who have autism.
Yes, absolutely. It's a spectrum, so there's varying, degrees. So, so some might exhibit those behaviors while others may not.
All right, and come to expect it and just roll with it, because it's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
If you can educate those individuals around, then that helps reduce stress and anxiety, which has that residual effect back down to the parents, caregivers, and then down to the individual suffering with the disorder.
Okay, and Patrick, the same question for you. What about noise for people who are mentally ill?
For people with mental illness, it can vary through the full spectrum. I mean, some folks are going to be more sensitive to noise. But one thing that we see is that many people who are very ill, profoundly ill, and they're generally the ones that are going to have the most needs in a shelter, they've actually many times lived in group environments. They've been in chaotic situations because of their illness and because of the type of care that they've received. One of the things we noticed in the shelters in Mississippi was that our folks seemed to do pretty good. They didn't, the environment itself was not such a trigger to them, as stressful as you might have thought. We tend to think of people with mental illness as fragile. That's not always the case. These are folks who've lived under very difficult circumstances, sometimes for their entire life. So it varies from person to person completely. Okay. I think with anybody in that situation, you want as much calm as is possible.
Joda, let me go back, and we're still on this issue of accommodations. I found out as we were talking and preparing for this program that people who are spinal cord injured don't sweat. And I would imagine at these shelters that they are going to be incredibly hot. What should shelter workers know about keeping people who are spinal cord injured comfortable?
Well, because an individual who suffered a spinal cord injury, they don't sweat to compensate for heat and cold. They do tend to get overheated very easily. And since you're going to be in a shelter and it's probably a big building, you're not going to have a personalized air conditioner or something. A wet towel, or a wet rag would not hurt at all, or actually it is important, very, very important for a person with a spinal cord injury to have a wet rag or a wet towel so they could apply it on themselves to cool, to keep their temperature normal or to keep them cool.
What happens if they don't have a wet rag or wet towel?
They could overheat. And they could suffer, and it is a very serious. They could overheat and suffer dehydration, that could lead to a lot of other problems.
Julia, you were raising your hand a moment ago.
Also, you have to look out for the out of the ordinary. So for the spinal cord, if they do sweat, that is out of the ordinary. That means they have an infection somewhere or a cut somewhere. You have to look for that. So that's important.
And because a spinal cord injured person may not have feeling in that part of the body where the injury has taken place, it becomes very serious.
It becomes very serious. There's a list of things that shelter workers can make themselves knowledgeable about, because a person with a spinal cord injury suffer a series of things called autonomic dysreflexia. There could be a series of reasons as to why he's sweating or why he's discomforted or something. So it needs to be investigated, for them to be aware of it.
But one other question about the health of people who have spinal cord injuries, and that is that their bones become very brittle. And this comes into play when they're being moved, for instance,
Yes.
moved from their chair into the bed or back. Talk about that for a moment.
Again, because of the spinal cord injury that make them immobile, they're not able to, move normally. Their bone become brittle. They suffer osteoporosis very easily because of their immobility. So if they are going to be lifted and put into a bed or taken out from their wheelchair, they should be handled with, utmost care.
And for you, as somebody who's got the experience living in a wheelchair, you would tell the shelter worker, this is the best way to lift me?
Yes. The person who suffered, who is disabled with a spinal cord injury, will be able to share that information with the shelter worker. Well, this is the right way or the wrong way, or you're doing it wrong per se. That, well, this is how it's safer for it to be lifted.
Let's talk about medications for a moment. And Dolores, let me start with you. Would you expect to bring medications for yourself or for your son to the shelter? And do those medications have to be handled in a particular way? For instance, are they refrigerated? What can you tell the shelter workers?
Well, the medication that he takes and I take won't have to be refrigerated, but he has to, he injects himself once a week with one of his medication. And that has to be, we'll just keep it protected in a plastic freezer bag, and the pills are kept in a plastic container with but usually we would take it in in the bottle, and then he likes to separate them every week in his own, in the container. And then once a week he gives himself a shot. Of course, I'm there with him because he has sometimes the palsy type behavior, and he wants to do it himself. And I'm there to make sure that all the bubble is out of the syringe and he's not hurting himself.
Mm-hmm. But should shelter workers be prepared, though, to inject?
They should, in case he can't and I'm not there momentarily, I might step away. Yes, but that's something that's just, that medication just taken at a certain time every week and on a certain day. Mm-hmm. So I would be there with him.
Patrick, what can you tell us about medication for the mentally ill?
Medication's a big issue for people with mental illness, and a lot of the problems that arise relate to the duration of time they're going to be in the shelter, because generally people would arrive at a shelter with maybe a couple of days of medication, possibly a week's worth. So that's one issue. But a lot of our folks have difficulty taking their medication, and they have sometimes caregivers in the community who assist them with that on a daily basis. Particularly here in Florida, we use something called our FACT teams, which is an acute kind of care in the community. And the FACT teams work with a lot of their folks to make sure that every day they take the medications, they take the right ones. So we try and make sure that people with those issues go to special needs shelters if possible, because that way they can get a little more intense help with taking their medications. The other thing with medications is that a lot of people will use some medications on an as-needed basis. So if a person self-identifies and comes in and says medication's an issue, they may want you to store it for them. They may not want to keep it on them. They may want to tell you what their medications are for and how you could help them to use them if they need them. And I would think if that's a question you also need to ask if you think that somebody's having a problem. Do you have some medication that you take when you feel this way? Which one is it? Can we help you with that? Mm-hmm. So.
I wonder if, let's say somebody's prescription is running out, or for some reason they don't bring enough medication to the shelter with them, what advice can you give the shelter workers?
It's really difficult. I mean, Florida, luckily, we haven't had any of the situations like Katrina and Rita where it was weeks and weeks at a time in shelters, without access to outside help, and there really wasn't much up there. But if we did have that, it would be a big issue because medications weren't available. They had pharmaceutical representatives coming in from around the country and working with the doctors who were in the field, in the shelters, and trying to make sure that they made available the meds that people needed on an emergency basis. But it can be a real problem because a lot of folks, I mean, you know, they may bring their 30-day supply of a medication, a bottle of medication. A lot of folks take medications that they only receive on a weekly basis from their caregiver because of issues of overdose. Sometimes just that they only receive them on a daily basis because of the same issues. So the only advice you can give a person who's dealing with someone without medication, who really needs their medication, is a lot of patience, to talk to the person, to be a calming influence for the person, to talk to them, again, respectfully, but comforting as much as you can. And if you're dealing with somebody who is escalating in their illness and they're going into crisis, and most people with mental illness are not that scary. I mean, most mental illness is an invisible illness, but some folks tend to become louder. Some types of illnesses like schizophrenia, many people are not as aware of personal boundaries as other folks, so they might get too close to you. They might talk in a loud voice. They're unaware of the fact that they're making you uncomfortable. So you need to, if you're aware of that and can react to that and not have it bother you as a shelter worker, that's a good thing. We work with our police forces to learn these kinds of things too, because they come into this stuff all the time. So talk in a low voice, calming. If a person is delusional, which is possible, where they think that something's going on that may or may not really be going on, you can't convince them that that's not true. You can tell them very straightforwardly that you don't see the same thing they see, you don't necessarily believe the same thing they believe, but you don't try and talk them out of their delusion. The main thing you can do in that case is to be a comfort as much as possible and a sounding board.
Does anybody else want to say anything more about medication before we move on?
You know, one of the major causes of blindness is diabetes, and many diabetics take insulin, and insulin is one of those medications that needs to be refrigerated. And also, blind people who are using insulin are able to give themselves their insulin themselves. So they are able to inject themselves. There's no need for any assistance in doing that.
Okay. Let's talk about privacy and bathroom issues, which I think put a strain on people in shelters. And Jody, if you don't mind, let's start with you. What kinds of things should shelter people know about preparing, first of all, for people who are in wheelchairs coming to their shelter? What should they be thinking about ahead of time?
Well, because people with physical disability may limit them to be able to move around freely to get to a bathroom, to and from. You know, so individuals with spinal cord injury, you know, they may not be able to get readily to a bathroom. So if the area in which they are in a hospital bed or wherever, it wouldn't hurt to have a private screen or something like that, so that if they need to do a bowel regimen, if they need to be straight cat to empty their bladder, you know, and that is something that the shelter workers should be aware, that the shelter should have accommodated catheter or a bedpan, that if they want to do something personally, you know, it's there. A urinal will help, you know, to have in shelters. Underpads, also that is important. You know, so for privacy, to have a private screen that they could just simply pull, because when you're in a shelter is a big building, open up. You know, no one will have a private room for themselves, you know, per se. So a private screen becomes very helpful for that.
Okay, and should the shelters make sure that they have adult diapers on hand? Should they make sure that they have some extra catheters on hand?
Yes, very much so, because you know, if it's an emergency and you have to leave your house in a rush for whatever the case, you may not be able to take all the necessary things that you need for your personal care. Body lotion may be helpful to have, and especially in shelters, you know, and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, anybody else want to talk about this issue? Dolores, this is an issue in your family too. Anything to add to what Joda said?
Exactly what he said is what's needed, a screen especially, because it's demeaning already. They feel very bad already going in.
This goes
and
back to that issue of dignity.
That's correct. That's correct. They just They feel so demeaned, and they need the privacy, and that's the only way they can have it. And I really hope that's possible for them, because it's very important that with Ronald, you know, he feels real bad even with me at times, you know, but it has to be. This is the way that you have to be cared for, or either you'll be in a nursing home. And we prefer not to have him in a nursing home. We want to keep him.
Mike, was there something you wanted to add to this?
Yes, the bathroom could be an issue with some. For example, my son. So just speaking about my particular situation, my wife is the one who provides, you know, most of the care for him, especially, you know, during the work hours, and taking him to the mall, and we try to get him exposed as much as possible. But when he needs to use the bathroom, she's the one who escorts him in, even though that he can use the facilities himself. So a good example, last night we're at the movies, and as we're walking out, he's decided he's got to use the bathroom, just takes off, you know, running from us and runs right into the ladies' bathroom. And wasn't a problem when he was younger, 7, 8, 9, but now he's 14, and it's still not a big problem, but, you know, that could just cause someone to be uncomfortable if they're in there, and a 14-year-old boy, he's going to get older in age, and, you know, next thing you know, you have a young man who's running in the ladies' room.
So the shelter workers should explain this to the other people that are staying in the shelter, that this may occur from time to time.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's talk about, it's got to be very disorienting, Dolores, for elderly people to leave their safe and secure surroundings and to be evacuated to a strange place and become disoriented. How do we help elderly people when they're evacuated? What are some of the things that we should be doing?
I think you should show compassion to them, understanding, and make them feel as comfortable as possible. Do as much as possible for them in the shelter, if possible, as to what they were doing in the facility, the nursing home, or wherever they were. And I'm speaking of even keeping them in a community-type atmosphere with, seriously, other elderlies, where they would feel comfortable, even with games, and they love to play cards, you know, and that would be the most important thing to them, and just show them compassion.
What about assigning them volunteer duties inside the shelter? Is that a good idea to keep their minds active?
If they're able to do it, they would enjoy it, because they feel they're giving. And elderly people love to give because this is all they can do now. And those that can't, they appreciate receiving, you know, but I think it would be wise to have elderly people do volunteer work.
What about asking other people to volunteer at the shelter?
I was going to say that too. You know, there's no reason why if I'm not there, or if I'm in a shelter and someone needs some assistance and there's something that I can do in order to assist and volunteer, it may be something that I may want to do and not be restricted from doing that just because I happen to be one of those disabled people. You know, again, it's a matter of equality. If you're going to ask someone who's not disabled to do something, you know, the same is true with a person who is. I think that I might want to volunteer if I were ever in a shelter, because I'm a musician. I could sing to people, or I'm also a counselor. I can assist in people with some of those issues. So there's a lot that I might do in a shelter if I were there.
And Julia, would you advise encouraging people to volunteer?
Yes, I would. That's basically what we do. We love being a part of the greater whole. So if we can do something to be part of that, to make it better, efficient, and smoother, then I think benefits it for both parties.
And one of the reasons that each of us is sitting on this panel is because we're all volunteers. You know, we are part of the volunteer community, working with our respective organizations and doing things for them on a volunteer basis. And so we've already got that volunteer experience, and we've already got that mindset of we want to be of service. So many of us could do that.
Something, we all have jobs, so we have something to contribute. I work with people with disabilities, so I do know what's out there. But it's up to us to let the shelter workers know what we can do
to
Let's-
assess the
let's-
situation.
Let's just go through, and we've got just a few minutes left. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to this conversation about what to expect, to tell the workers what to expect if somebody with a disability comes into a shelter? I know that there's a lot of topics we didn't talk about, but Patrick, could I start with you? Is there anything else that we need to tell the workers out there that they should be prepared for?
Well, I think we've covered most of it. I think the main point, as far as the folks that I work with, and being a person with a mental illness myself, people working with me, is that thing of, you know, we tend to think of mental illness in a certain way in this country, and we tend to some degree demonize it, and we think of people with mental illness as potentially dangerous. That's highly unlikely. Actually, the incidence of violence among people with mental illness, particularly people in treatment, is no different than the general population, and we're 2.5 more times to be a victim of a crime than to be a perpetrator, 2.5 more times than the average population. So treat the people with respect, treat them as you wish you would be treated. And again, if somebody is in distress, really there's very little that you can do beyond calming, being of assistance, being a friendly listener.
Mm-hmm. Mike, anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation?
The shelter workers, unfortunately, might need to be prepared to get complaints from other individuals because individuals suffering with the autism spectrum disorder can have maladaptive behaviors, and to where the families, the caregivers, and parents are used to being inconvenienced from these behaviors, it quickly gets on the nerves of individuals who have not had to live in that environment. And I would anticipate maybe those individuals, you know, complaining.
So bring some patience, bring a lot of patience.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And Marion, how about you?
Well, I would like to say that the treatment of the person and treating them with dignity, of course, is always important. That one of the myths of blindness is that blind people are helpless and dependent, and nothing is further from the truth. Also, I wanted to say one of the things we didn't touch upon is that if there's ever an issue with a person who comes into a shelter with a service animal that is because of someone else's reaction to that service animal, it's up to that person who has the issue to resolve that issue, not the person with the service animal. In other words, if I come into a shelter and someone says, I'm allergic to dogs, or I am afraid of dogs, then it's not the shelter's responsibility to say, okay, Marion, you come with me, you and your dog, we're going to put you in a different place. It's up to them to resolve the issue with the other person who has the problem, the fear, the allergy, whatever, and not to separate us from the general population.
Mm-hmm. Dolores, would you like to add?
I just say they are really to be considered and understood, not to talk down to them, not to get irate, and pay attention to the motive of what everything is about. Why are we there? To help and keep everybody calm as possible, even the disabled ones. And then there are times that I know Ronald, at times when something is going on in the house, he may not hear, but he feels it. Mm-hmm. He feels it. And then it upsets him. And then he goes into a tantrum of palsy-type behavior. The entire chemistry in his body just go wacko. So that needs to be considered a lot, because then it can reflect back to people thinking there's a mental illness in that individual, and it's not that. It's just trying to keep them calm and collective at that time, and it's the way you approach them.
Mm-hmm. Julia?
I think the panelists had pretty much said it all.
Yeah.
We're a person first before our disabilities. So if I walk in and I tell you I'm deaf, I'm not deaf first, I'm a person. Okay. And I have something to contribute, just like all of us do. Judd, and we commend you for doing the wonderful work that you're doing.
All right, and Joda?
I think the shelter workers, the one thing that they need to really bring with them is a lot of patience and compassion when dealing with individuals with disability, and that will take them through.
All right, panel, thank you very much. Thank you for watching the program.